Okay, let's begin. Hush now. All right, thank you. So let's begin. Welcome to this talk, The Deep Learning Time Fake State Ecology by Benjamin Bratton. Before introducing Benjamin, let me just make a few announcements. If you want to leave, the exits may be behind you. Look to the left and right. Try not to leave through the front door because it's quite disruptive to the talk because of the noise from the door. I want to thank as well Claudia Pasquale at the Bartlett and Rosalie Dobali at the ICA for co-organizing Ben's visit to London. His visit just wouldn't be possible without the three institutions collaborating together. Ben gave a fantastic talk, Alphaville, at the Bartlett last night. It was also a marathon performance, so I want to go gentle with him this evening. And he's going to be doing a talk called The Whole Age of Computer Has Made It Where Nobody Knows Exactly What's Going On. I think that's not your syntax, is it?
It's a quote.
It's a quote. Okay, to be revealed tomorrow at the ICA from 6:30. And Helen Hester will be responding to Ben at the ICA. So as I said, Ben wouldn't be here if the three institutions hadn't got together to organize it and to fund his visit. And I think to my understanding or knowledge, it's the first time these three institutions have worked together to bring a speaker over, which I think gives an indication of the impact and significance of Ben's thinking to cultural practice ideas across the board. The difference between the Bartlett, the School of Architecture, and Department of Art and Visual Culture here at Goldsmiths, because within Goldsmiths itself, the talk is co-organized between the postgraduate talk series, which usually runs on Monday, and the Thursday evening talk series organized by the Department of Visual Culture. And in the Department of Visual Culture, I want to thank Bridget Krohn and Eric Gunkel for making this talk possible on this occasion as part of an Alien Time public lecture program, which is inaugurated today. And this series, it's outlined here in the slide, but approximately it's going to examine what happens in time, and in particular to futurity, more specifically, as conditions of planetary complexity, epistemological disarray, and at greater than human scales of operational conditions. So there's a poster which describes some of the events. Today is the opening talk, the screening and discussion on the 22nd with Zach Blass, who's here. A discussion of a workshop on Christina Sharp on the 23rd, and then a two-day symposium discussion event, including a number of speakers thinking about time travel, futurity. So I'd urge you all to go to that if you're not already thinking of doing so. So I think given the context of this series, given the institutions that have come together, I think it's particularly fitting that Benjamin Bratton gives the first talk in this series. If you don't know already, I'm sure most of you are here because you know Benjamin's work. He's a professor of visual arts at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, program director at Strelka Institute of Media Architecture and Design in Moscow, and as if that wasn't enough, he's also a professor of digital design at the European Graduate School at South Bay in Switzerland. And I'm sure most of you will know his work from the Stack. It's a big book. It's also, I'll explain in a minute. I think this book is it's been a significant, if not the decisive contribution to reshaping our thinking and practices of cultures of computation and what computation is as a social fact and a political fact from now. In the last 10, 15 years and from now. And it came out 2 years ago, about the same time as another book with another syntactically challenging title, Dispute Plans to Prevent Future Luxury Constitution from Efflux. And David Brett is here from the Word Bookshop to sell the books at special discount prices. The Stack is going for 20 quid, which is a total bargain if you don't have it. So he's going to be here towards the end of the talk if you want to get books. He'll also, if the books sell out, he'll take orders to get them for you after the fact. Now, with these books, as well as his other writings and talks, Ben has both speculates on scenarios and the new conditions, which are now possible in dynamic social and cultural transformations generated by what he's definitively called planetary scale computation. So this is now a fairly common term, but I think it was your coining. my understanding. And I think, again, the impact of Ben's thinking and contributions to understanding where we are and what to do next is kind of paid testimony by the ubiquity of the term planetary scale computation within the 2 years that the book has come out. So through the deployment of speculative fictions, as well as the detailed, rigorous theorizing of how what he's also called an accidental megastructure of planetary scale computation, how all of this presents a step change from the basic premises of political, legal, social, and communicative modernity as it's been developed from the North Atlantic over the past 3.5 centuries to a now global systemic operation. But that's history, and what we're facing now is a whole new set of conditions, which I think Ben is at the forefront of theorizing. These aren't just, what he does, I think, are not just descriptions or maps of what is now going on, but also, crucially, what can now happen, what is unfixed in new megascale, more than human societies being built thanks to computational infrastructures. So this is a striking, demanding, and I think necessary work. And Ben Bratton is more or less defining the terms for this theoretical and practical engagement. So I'm really thrilled that he's kindly accepted our invitation to speak at Goldsmiths, and I ask you to please join me in welcoming him here.
Well, thank you, Suhail, for that very extraordinary introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Make sure the audio's good. And it is really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see a lot of old friends. Zach, who I met originally when I was teaching at UCLA, and it's a pleasure to see Arit Rogoff, who was my professor when I was an undergraduate a long time ago, and a lot of new faces besides. So thank you all for coming. And to allowing me to share some of this new work with you. As Suhail mentioned, we're in the middle of a 3-talk series here in London. The first one last night was dealing with issues of AI at urban scale at the Bartlett, and the one tonight feeling a bit more philosophically oriented around issues of vision, and particularly models of vision and the role of models in vision, and specifically machine vision, how it is that we see matter, how matter sees us, how matter sees us seeing matter, and so on, and how it is that what we call machine vision, is not only a kind of vision, but a kind of thinking as well, a kind of thinking/seeing. Which we touched on a little bit last night in terms of the implications of this at urban scale, but I want to go a bit deeper into these issues around questions of representation and the model. Now, before I go direct into this, I want to start a little bit with a bit of a framing. The talk, as I see it, is not just about how technologies, is about not only how technologies provide for new kinds of functions, and involve in relationship to an intermingling of functions, and I mean specifically a technical evolution, and counter functions. But how it is that they can also, in their emergence, reveal things that had been there all along, which are real even without that technology, but which may be difficult or impossible to notice without it. And these thoughts are offered as well in dialogue with my friend Yok Hui's provocation for a heterogeneous, what he calls a cosmotechnics. And I come to London via Hong Kong, where Yok and I taught a seminar for the Strelka students over there on research, as part of a research trip. Now, this term cosmotechnics, was developed in dialogue with Bernard Stiegler, and the term refers to a kind of slippage, but also a binding between how an historically embedded ontology and a society-scale technical system may inform one another or counterform one another. And that, the way he means it is that while, for example, gunpowder or camera obscura may have been invented in China much earlier than in Europe, these were, according to him, actually not the same technologies. They were posited by and for a social cosmology, if you like, that comprehended them quite differently, as different things, as different disclosures, and so they were. And so in different ways, Yuka and I are both invested in what you might call a cosmotechnics to come. Now, I'm less inclined perhaps to try to sort of find that in a recuperation of traditions, but am quite open, I think, to be plain about it, drawing from them directly, nevertheless. That is, I'm interested in a delinking, if you like, of realism and universalism from its European, parochial, and provincial visions as the basis of that cosmotechnics to come. So, while there may be some divergent and incomparable ways to conceive technical systems, there's also what Yuka calls technical irreducibles. That is, we find no square wheels in the anthropological record, for example. The process of a technical epistemology then forges these, is then based on a forging of two interrelated demystifications. That first, things that we thought were inexplicable and ineffable turn out to be effable. Diseases are caused by microbes, not migrants. And likewise, things that we thought were unclouded and direct images of the world as it is turn out to be folklore, the Europeanness of reason, for example. So, in other words, the privileged position of the ineffable, that sublime remainder lying beyond cognitive capacity, is thus set in a kind of God of the gaps position, asked to describe less and less as things are reduced to explanations that themselves suggest irreducibility. Hooray for the effable. But this is itself perhaps more strange than it appears, if only that because of the physical limitations of our cognitive hardware, there should be, by definition, many more things that we cannot think than we can. More of the universe should be unthinkable, even by feats of linguistic or more of the should be, even by feats of linguistic, vectoral, and computational abstraction and compression. And so, this cosmotechnics to come would entail both an adherence to the complexity of cosmologies that might compose the resistance of the real, and which would include both the universal binding of the irreducible and the open unbinding of relations to that which exceeds its representation. What we need to guard against, then, is the tendency to reduce the complexity of the system itself to the complexity of the control system that we might use to compose, to think the system. We need to, in fact, to invert this. Now, as Suhail mentioned, some of the work that I'll be discussing, in a way, is part of the follow-up to the follow-up book to this project, the Stack, which is in the process of taking shape. For those of you who haven't encountered the book, the basic argument is that planetary scale computation has both distorted and deformed traditional modern logics of political geography and takes and introduces and produces new territories in its own image. And furthermore, that these genres, if you like, of planetary scale computation take different forms at different scales and operate in different ways, but that they together interoperate in a way that is analogous to that of a software-hardware stack. And that by understanding this interoperability, the modularity of this accidental megastructure, it becomes possible to think it in a kind of provisional totality that may allow for its redesign and recomposition in ways that would not be possible only through tactical forms of tactical address. And so To walk sort of quickly through this, these different layers operating in this way, beginning with an earth layer at the bottom by which the material substrate that forms the basis of any kind of computational process is to be found, by which the monitoring, addressing, enunciation, enumeration of ecological flows become sites of intensive sensing, quantification, and governance for their own sake. A cloud layer at which platform economics creates virtual geographies in its own image, where we see cloud platforms increasingly taking on more of the traditional functions of the modern nation state, and importantly, as I'll talk about tomorrow night, the ICA, how states themselves increasingly evolve into cloud platforms. It's also, by the way, where in the countryside where most of the cloud actually lives. At the city layer, we have, it's again, cloud producing these irregular kinds of geographies, platforms taking on more of these kinds of functions. A city layer by which vast discontiguous networks weave borders into enclaves and escape routes. Virtual addressing systems that locate billions of entities and events into unfamiliar maps. Interfaces presenting vibrant augmentations of reality which populate this tangled apparatus. And finally, a user layer comprised of both humans and non-humans with which we move and which pilot and which are piloted by the mechanism as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, Liam Young. Now, the talk tonight, which is dealing with, is I guess you could sort of think of it located specifically at the interface layer here as well, because it's looking at particularly these questions of vision and how it is that entities, users within this apparatus see one another, sense one another, and make sense of one another in particular ways, in particular forms of categorical motivated vision. And so in the next book, as we're beginning to develop this layered system a bit more as well, in this interface, as we develop the question of the interface layer chapter, there's a section in which I develop a more specific argument around the qualifications of machine vision as a way of understanding this larger process of emergence of AI. And so the talk that I'll do tonight is sort of drawing this particular thread with a bit more specificity and hopefully detail. So appreciate your attention. Now, on the one hand, so let me sort of start with, the relationship between matter and image, between architecture and image, and how it is that the physical environment cooperates and participates in the construction of images. It goes back, obviously, at least to much, much earlier pre-modern technologies. In Camera Obscura, with Plato's cave, it becomes the basis of even foundational philosophical systems to understand the relationship of how it is that our models of the world stand in for the world in ways that both allow for knowledge and prevent knowledge from happening at the same time. A special form of image, the map, is based on a kind of information reduction by which the complexity of the distribution of objects in space in the world is reduced to a diagrammatic image that has a specific navigational function. And maps, in this sense, we can understand as a kind of precursor to the graphical user interface, which are also based on a necessary map reduction of the possibilities of action and interaction with the system, to a synthetic diagrammatic image that is itself necessarily and inevitably ideological. We begin, so the photography really begins, we're sort of looking backward as a kind of, in terms of our chemical modernity, as a series of experiments of the way in which light imprints itself and reacts to surfaces within the world, reacts to matter in particular ways, leaving traces of itself on matter as in relationship to kinds of chemical treatments and that we might introduce to it itself. As we begin to think about the question of the materiality of machine vision, going back to the materiality of the mechanical image from its very beginning allows us some of these questions as sort of the insight. As photography becomes cinema, we rediscover the materiality of the image in any number of different kinds of ways, by addressing, dismantling and composing with that dismantled medium for any number of different kinds of projects, of course, Stan Brakhage being what we see here. Vision, however, this is not the only history that we need to attend to in order to understand the genealogy and the composability of machine vision. Vision evolved many times over the course of the millennia. Various photoreceptor cells are found across the phyla. They have evolved from chemoreceptors in any number of different ways, in many, many different times. And in most cases, and in many cases, they evolved in advance of any brain-like information organs that may have made some kind of modeled, recursive, abstracted sense of those receptions itself. In other words, vision, if we take vision more generally to be ways in which matter in the world responds to light, produces in a way in which allows for some kind of primordial navigational abstraction and location in relationship to the world, more generally, it's something that is a much more diverse property of things than our own particular case would allow for. Now, arguably, over the last 2 decades, vision has evolved again. This time, not for cuttlefish or rattlesnakes, but for CCD sensors and algorithmic armatures processing what is sensed into differentiated, motivated recognition and cognition. Today, many images are made for no one, but this does not mean that they are functionless. They are, after Harun Farokhi, actually exactly functional images. They are made by and for machines that see them and see the world differently than we do. Those machines do not have eyeballs or rods and cones or a visual cortex, but they do have sensors that detect light and motion and form and heat and color in different ways. Quote-unquote visual sensors respond to light, but they are themselves not always shaped like cameras. They are perhaps just designed surfaces capable of synthetic sensation and computational interpretation. And in the wider urban landscape, they commingle with networks of other superficial sensors, or on assembly lines, they observe objects in passing, differentiating and sorting the normal from the abnormal. The industrial scale processing of data then has been gleaned and is gleaned by a scanning of the light spectrum in various different ways, from urban scale street surveillance to millimeter scale quality control along assembly lines. And taken as a whole, this represents a plurality of all the work that the world does to image itself for the purpose of governing human society, even if they are images that we can't see and images that we don't make. At the end of the day, the machinic phylum takes more selfies than selves do. The function, however, of representation, if we want to call it that, is quite different. The quote-unquote, in many cases, the quote-unquote image remains data, and it is never re-rendered to look like a, quote, picture, because there is no need. The algorithm that's programmed to discern a particular pattern or anomaly can see that pattern or anomaly directly in the data itself. It does not necessarily need for that data to be reprojected, as if for a mammal, and then re-seen and reinterpreted back into code. Like the algorithmic scanning and sorting of any large data set, the fact that the original source was, quote-unquote, visual is, in fact, not so critical. We have, then, something like vision without images. Now, photosynthesis is, of course, a chemical response to light, And so in the broadest sense, if you want to make the case, you could also say that it too could be considered as a kind of vision without images. The question then is, like plants, do machines also possess a kind of vision without images? And is this vision without images, in what ways is this vision without images the same or different than a vision without models? Which is what I'll be talking to in a moment. Or at least to what kind of images, what kind of image without, or is it at least a kind of image without natural abstraction from corporeal experience? Is an abstraction that is based on a chemical or informational pattern finding, but not necessarily a cartographic simulation of experience? Or, in fact, is it all those things? This is, in a way, part of the line of questioning for the remainder, the structure of the talk. Before, however, in terms of this question of the scope and quantity of the image structure that we're sort of talking about, a word on regular, normal human images and the purposes to which we put them. The Animalian vision image-making nexus is primarily human. Sometimes monkeys take photos. But it's likely that but it isn't likely that from the beginning of the Holocene, that the total quantity of images that humans have produced, from cave walls to FaceTime, measured per year, measured in total pounds of pictures, total gigabytes of information, and so forth, continues to increase exponentially. Now, with digital imaging machines in everyone's pocket, the raw sum of human images produced since a former student of mine who's now at Instagram provided me this estimate. The raw sum of images produced since the year 2011 may be more than those produced in all of human history before that year. It depends on how you quantify an image. But again, is it per pound? Is it by data? Is it just discrete files? How do you want to sort of model these things like this? But who's to say? But what's certain is that what Benjamin called mechanical reproducibility has certainly allowed images to proliferate far beyond the means of human craft. Quantity, in other words, becomes a quality, becomes an aesthetic as well. The aesthetic, in turn, becomes inseparable from the function of the functional image. Now, what do I mean? Perhaps surprising to some, perhaps not at all surprising, the function of machinic images today and of their abstractions, both animal and algorithmic, is increasingly to determine the veracity and originality of what the images present. That is, for thinking animals, seeing and making things is easy, but making copies of what is seen is hard. For machines, on the other hand, making copies is a way of seeing and much easier than thinking, or perhaps it is a kind of thinking. Now, for media technologies that link the two, when information is scarce, then copying something is the work of the mechanical image. However, when information is abundant, especially when overabundant, then seeing the original, marking the original, picking the pattern out of the background, this is the work of machine vision. For example, some of the shapes printed on a dollar bill are there for humans to differentiate semantically the value of one token from another token. But far more of them are there for machine vision counterfeit detection systems to verify that this is a real dollar. The piece of paper is in fact full of machines. These machines happen to look like pictures. It is image as machine. Or a surveillance scan of a city may pick out one face, one person, one body from thousands in motion, looking for the one true target. Elsewhere, we insert tiny cameras into great paintings so as to verify that they are the originals, as is often required by insurance companies backing purchases. Online CAPTCHA software shows an image as a kind of quick inversion of the Turing test, and then analyzes how the user interprets it to determine if they are, in fact, a real person. And so we conclude then that Benjamin's assurances that the mechanical reproduction would undermine the aura of the original is true when, for example, we compare a painting and a postcard of a painting. However, when machine vision and images as machines are put to work to ensure erratic originals, verified non-fakes, true identities, unbroken versions, normal targets, and certified real deals, a full revolution has been made back around. As the image is more fully technological, as it becomes itself a machine, Benjamin's historical arc from pre-mechanical original to mechanical copy is incomplete without another curve leading to a kind of machinic authentic. Still, the machinic visual subject, you or I, is not something that necessarily, in this case, is not something that always and necessarily must possess human-like or human-level perceptual and aesthetic capacities, machine vision systems, that is, for it to do this. It doesn't require our aesthetics. But rather, it is something that is interesting and uncanny because it does not possess an aesthetics, perhaps, and yet it still can see us. It can recognize us, regardless, and that is weird enough. And I think there is then, there is the question then of how the world looks like as a screen that art has explored in some depth. And another, I think, rather more important is how, or equally important, is how we look as objects of perception from the position of the machines with which we co-occupy the world. That is, seeing ourselves through the eyes of this machinic other who does not and cannot have an affective sense of aesthetics per se, is a kind of disenchantment. We are just stuff in the world for distributed machine cognition to look at and to make sense of. Our own sapience is real and unique, but we are as things to observe that just happen to be sapient. This doesn't really matter to machine vision. And I think this disenchantment is more than just like hearing the sound of your recorded voice on tape. That's not me. It's potentially the clearing away of a more closely guarded illusion. This uncomfortable recognition in the machine's mirror is a kind of inverse uncanny valley. Instead of being creeped out at how slightly inhuman the creature in the image appears, we are creeped out at how unhuman we ourselves look through the creature's eyes. Now, we add computation to this, not just seeing, but information processing. We want to then ask, on this question of computation, we're taking vision as a kind of emergent property of matter. Computation, so too, is an emergent property of matter. Machine vision, as it exists now, could be seen as an amalgamation of these two. Computation increasingly becomes not something that a particular type of object in the world, a computer, does, but rather a generic property of things in the world, a particular kind of solvent of algorithmic reason into matter. We take it, for example, that computation was more discovered than it was invented, and that it is one of the things that matter so arranged is capable of doing. It is capable of procedural abstraction. Among these, sapient brain tissue is matter that has achieved intelligence in ways that both clearly and clearly are not, quote, computational in the conventional sense. We also take it that the solution of synthetic computation into the urban fabric, provides that landscape with inorganic forms of sorts of distributed intelligence because it provides them with the capacity for abstraction. That is, intelligence as abstraction, computation as intelligence, computation as abstraction. Now, this perspective should account for at least two related but different understandings. One would recognize that intelligence and knowledge is always distributed among multiple positions and forms of life, both similar and dissimilar to one another, and that no single neuroanatomical disposition has a privileged monopoly on how to think intelligently. What might qualify as a general intelligence is not duty-bound to species or phylum, but to this capacity for abstraction. The ability of an organism, however primitive, to map its surroundings, particularly in relation to basic terms of friend, food, and foe, is a primordial abstraction from which we do not graduate so much as to develop into something like reason and its local human variations. And in this way, the mapping of abstraction is not an early stage through which things pass on their way towards more complex forms of intelligence. It is rather a general principle of that complexification. Like protozoa and their cilia feeling about how to figure out what is where, or humans looking and tasting and imagining patterns, today's forms of AI are sometimes augmented by various technologies of machine cognition, machine sensation, and machine vision that allow them to see and sense the world out there and to abstract the forms of a mechanically embodied intelligence, both deliberately programmed for them and emerging unexpectedly. Now, just like for us, the tasks to which we put these systems in many cases are forms of our tasks of pattern recognition. We are ourselves a species that was able to be relatively successful as we are based on our capacities for pattern recognition. The evolutionary price that we pay for this capacity of pattern recognition is the false positive, seeing patterns that aren't actually there, which we call apophenia. And the thing about apophenia is even when you know the pattern that you're looking at is not really there, you can't help seeing it anyway. Part of the function of the functional images in the functional image-making systems that we are composing are ones that hopefully are able to assist us, our prostheses, if you like, in the differentiation of false positives from true positives, of correlation of actual causality from mere correlation. But they also can just as easily be extensions and prostheses of those apophenic categorical misinterpretations of themselves, just apophenia plus computing. For example, we were doing some work at the Strelka program last week with Charette with some people from the Google's Artist and Machine Intelligence group, which was the group in the research area of Google that was responsible for these deep dream images, which I assume you're more or less familiar with. Those of you who are not, the basic idea of this is you have an AI that's trained on the image set data set that is looking for faces of dogs in images. You take the images that don't have dogs in them, you ask them to find the image of dogs in them, to essentially then do amounts to a kind of find edges filter on the part that seems to be somewhat dog-like. And then you feed the image back in itself. And what you eventually get are the AI hallucinating dogs in anything. Anything it looks at, it will see dogs in them as well. And you get this kind of amazing, with the 4K projector, you get really nice kind of swirly patterns. Food, I don't recommend necessarily. In this as well, but there's lots of websites you can upload your travel photos, whatever you like, into these as well to amuse your friends, or just creep yourself out, whatever. Porn is not also really bad. The images themselves are remarkable enough on their own. But I mean, part of what's interesting here, I think, is this sort of transference. That there's a way in which that the viewer of these images makes a kind of partial empathetic transference to this other mind of the feature recognition algorithms and their way of seeing. The effect, in a way, is a kind of a mode of perception and making sense of the world through those eyes, or an attempt to see, like, how would this thing see the world? What is the world through this kind of eyes? And of course, there's then really two kinds of layers of apophenia at work here. There's the apophenia of the algorithm that's finding dog face shaped things in pictures. And then there's the secondary apophenia by which we look at the pictures and say, yeah, I see a dog too. And so there's this apophenia on top of apophenia that essentially becomes the problem with which we would like to work. Now, this process of sort of apophenic disclosure and transparency, of course, is a longer evolutionary arc. The dynamics of predator-prey and display camouflage are themselves apophenic kinds of responses, and ones that we certainly see developing in terms of AI at urban scale as well. We're at an interesting moment with AI in that it's good enough, it works well enough that you can use it in relation to machine vision systems to do things that just would seem quite remarkable just to sort of use it, but it's not quite good enough that it gets sort of a right. So if those of you who use the AR function on the Google Translate app, where you can hold your phone up to something written in a different language and it'll immediately translate it for you. This is a Korean restaurant menu in Moscow. It generates this sort of amazing, poetic, spontaneous ontological statements about the flat ontology correspondence from various different kinds of flesh. Or, for example, these sort of potentially quite medically dangerous suggestions. That is, we're at this sort of point where what we're seeing in a way is that the AI systems we're developing are already exceeding and overflowing these more prosaic and pedestrian functions to which they were sort of put. And whether they mean to or not, or whether we mean for them to not, one way or another, they're already beginning to speak in tongues. And I think we should, instead of fixing them too early, we should find a different course to encourage this evolutionary track sort of for its own sake. Now, what I want to then locate this, especially not just in terms of natural language processing, which I'll get to that as well, but in terms of machine vision, and this is what will be the remainder of this is around. Now, most machine vision systems around of AI, just to sort of keep it sort of straight and simple, are based on deep learning systems, which are themselves based on the training of multiple layers of artificial neural network systems. For that, you see the sort of input layers and output layers of these systems as well, and many of you may have been working with these already. Now, the kinds of quote-unquote images that these systems are capable of producing are, in many respects, perhaps the defining images of our time. So there's an artist that I've been working with for quite some time around some of these issues and trying to develop a more critical language, named Trevor Paglen. And these are, one of Trevor's projects is the development of what he calls neurods. Now, within this within the multiple layers of artificial neural networks, you've got inputs coming in from one side, going through the layers, and output layers on the other side. Now, if you ask one of those layers in the middle to say, okay, fine, now before you finish all this processing, spit out what you're thinking, what you get are these kinds of images. I mean, this is the other thing. We just call these all images. They can't. There needs to be a more specific glossary to define what kind of image this is. So just calling them all images isn't enough. So Trevor calls these neurods. So these are 12 different ones on 12 different networks, and say, may layer 47 spit out what you're thinking right now, and you get something like that. Now, the thing is, this looks nothing like the input or the output. It's like a kind of one neuron dreaming as it works itself out. Now, another interesting thing around these things are what we call classifier images. Classifier images within these systems are a quite interesting phenomenon. Classifier image is the image that is statistically most likely to correspond to a particular object and nothing else. So, for example, This is an image of the most statistically probable picture of a shark, minus everything else that a picture of a shark has in common with other objects about which the AI has traced. So all the things that are shark minus the non-shark things. But this is based from a network that is really good at picking out images of sharks, where you can feed it lots of pictures, and it will get it right of where the sharks are in sort of the picture, and yet that's the, quote, model of shark, at least as that model is being re-represented back to us as something we see as an image. So here's more classifier images around this sort of as well. And I'll zoom in a little bit around this as well. So the absolute pool table, the metaphysical ring-neck snake. Now again, these are from networks that it's not that they're messing up. They're really good at it, but this is, again, this sort of minor thing as well. Now, what we see then in these sort of traces, when we ask the system, say, okay, now speak, now draw me a picture of how you see, it does what it can to produce something that we, in fact, don't recognize as part of how it would use this as an interpretive function, and yet there it is. This also, in a way, is also part of the weakness and complexity of this as well. Some of you who work in this area will also be familiar with what are called universal adversarial perturbations, which is also, you can also drop that at a party. What universal adversarial perturbations are is, okay, so the one on the left, the neural network is 57% confident that that's a panda. Okay, you add that noise filter to it, which is the adversarial perturbations, just an 8% noise filter, to produce an image that on the right looks to you and me like, well, it's exactly the same. Now it's 99% sure that that's a given. And now the reason they're called universal perturbations is that you can use these filters on almost any network and you'll get the same kind of result, which is strange, because these networks are trained with very different kinds of data. And so you train the network with the data, and it gets very good at finding pandas, or very good at finding pool tables, or very good at finding sharks. But you put the same filter inside of the network, and it will not necessarily all result in gibbons, but it will confuse it one way or another. Here are some examples of these. I don't know if you can read this. Wool, Indian elephant, African gray parrot, three-toed sloth, who's to say? It's a bit like the preface to Order of Things, with the things drawn with a very fine camel hair brush and the having spilled the milk and so forth. Except this is a machine, not a tool, not a book. All right. Now I want to then take just the quick remainder of the remainder of the time to unpack some of the implications of this modeling and counter modeling. And then we'll go to the much more interesting part of the evening, which will be the discussion. Now, because of its virtuosity with abstraction, art has a crucial role to play in the development of AI, but its adherence to routines of symbolization at the expense of a more demystified materialism may obscure that project. That is, many of the most critical and difficult challenges to art and design posed by the maturation of artificial intelligence are those that disturb the gravity of the human figure as the agent and beneficiary of aesthetics and as the implied audience for its gestures. The status of representation takes on special importance, but is shifted on more than one axis. The representation of AI and the importance of non-anthropocentric models. 2, the function and fate of models and representation within AI, the shift from top-down symbolic models to bottom-up deep learning models, for example, and also how to forensically re-represent the hidden layers of the black box, which may be opaque even to their programmers. And this chain of mimesis is broken several times along the way. But those breaks themselves may be translated visually. But if so, what abstraction provides a sufficiently realist account of them? Art's encounter with machine intelligence draws then as much on anthropogeny as it does on contemporary expertise. Figural abstraction is one outcome of the cognitive revolutions roughly 70,000 years ago, and it enabled the eventual establishment of Neolithic economies. What Wittgenstein called the ritual animal learned to invoke and index and calculate and demonstrate and incant and perform or otherwise prototype a future condition into becoming thereby. And in doing so, we also learn to confuse means and ends, symbolization with what is symbolized. In our secular time, the aestheticization of politics, for example, can bemuse as much through gallery-based participatory relational negation as through the institutional spectacle of national honor and traditional demarcation. As for AI, intelligence, quote, of course, is also a matter of identification, as much as recognition. And we have many different kinds of animal and plant intelligence across the kingdoms, but today's artificial neural network-based AIs are instead a kind of mineral intelligence, and in this perhaps novel. That novelty then opens up further the definition of intelligence and its form and its formalism. AI evolved in the past half century or so, largely understood as a cognitive technology that appears in the image of man, quote unquote, or as a golem-like woven figure controlled by unseen forces. The popular account of Turing's test changed it from changed this from a sufficient condition of intelligence, that is, if the machine could pass as a human, this would be sufficient condition to nominate it as intelligence, to in fact a necessary condition, that unless it appears to think the way we think, it cannot be intelligent. Now, given the authority, efficacy, and charisma of symbolic models, it is not surprising then that the initial attempts to build AI using modern computers relied largely on building logical symbolic models of a problem space, then calculating those relations top down. It did not, however, prove to be the shining path. This is not how it works. As we learn now through deep learning systems to engage AIs that think without symbols, we in turn learn much more about the limits and the potential capacities of our own symbolic faculties, fortunes, and misapprehensions. The open figure of human intelligence thereby evolves. And that position of agency, obviously open as well to many different kinds of subjects and subject positions, is one, but by this I don't mean therefore one of animistic projection, but simply that the tool and the tool user switch seats all the time as a matter of course. The relationships by which one prostheticizes the other oscillate constantly. And while this basic principle of oscillation was well known to, for example, actor network theory and its variants, it has been of late desecularized by some new materialisms, quote unquote, that conflate perhaps the mythologically inscribed agency of non-humans with the material agency that they have irrespective of human narration of their role. The frog or the cell phone does not know or care that it is someone's spirit animal, but its function in an ecological niche persists anyway, including but not limited to the fact that the local hominids will interact with it according to those same narrating motivations, which become themselves social facts. Elsewhere, as they set in motion dynamic evolutionary processes of gaming and form finding and lines of flight between multiple interacting gambits, Other methods allow for collaboration with the distributed cognition already embodied in the world before we arrived. Sometimes technologies that appear to be subordinate, such as conversational user interfaces, and other systems that rely on natural language processing may be making sense of their inputs and interacting for purposes quite different than those defined by the single human user, artist, designer, so forth. And with such interspecies communication, collaboration is then possible, even if based around quite different goals, if that's even the right word in this sense. So beyond human-AI interaction, we should also consider how AI and intelligent non-human animals, such as crows and ants and octopi, may interact together and make good on their designs on the world and on us once they are so outfitted. And lastly, obviously, not all thinking is intelligent, but to the extent that intelligence is an emergent quality and capacity of natural and artificial systems, then this wide spectrum should provide for diverse projects in creative engineering and expression. And for many of these, our own version is neither normative nor regulatory. The animality of automation takes flight. So, how then do we see it seeing us, and us seeing it seeing the world, and seeing us as the world? The representation of AI is exceedingly difficult because even though its achievements have developed in proximity with philosophical thought experiments, that AI begins as a thought experiment, that becomes a technology, that becomes a thought experiment, and so forth and so on, its reality cuts across different kinds of conceptual categories. It's much more difficult to understand the role of representation within AI, or lack thereof, and then more difficult still to then re-represent that lack. So, while art and design will make emphatic, important, essential conceptual contributions to how we understand what synthetic intelligence is and ought to be, sensitivity to the symbolic order can, as suggested, lead us to conflate how AI is constructed discursively with what AI might actually be doing and what it can do, leading then to another sort of anthropocentric fallacy. The machinic phylum is more than a screen on which signification is projected, and so we see, we are attentive thereby. So, to clarify with a bit more detail why representation within AI's own process is such concern, let me sort of briefly unpack a little bit about how that symbolic process worked and then fell apart, and some of the distinctions between what we call top-down and bottom-up AI. The latter, bottom-up AI, is represented then by these contemporary deep learning systems and the artificial neural network systems, which I've demonstrated. Most of what was called good old-fashioned AI, GoFi, the Marvin Minsky era of AI, worked according to the explicative power, as said, of logical models that would, in their way, represent the problem space in advance, such that any particular instance of the problem could be calculated and solved according to these generic rules. Now, these systems do have some advantages, but recent advances in deep learning and AI in general are based, as I've said, on artificial neural networks that take on multiple inputs in forming weighted hidden layers and produce outputs which may be further trained and corrected. The resulting networks form a structure that learns how to recognize and parse and compose and process information. And these are analogous to biological neural networks, which for us produce different states of mind according to memories and talents and likes and dislikes and so forth. Now, deep learning systems, however, do not form models of their inputs and outputs. They are a machine which can identify a particular feature in an image and do so without representation. How this is different from human cognition is an ongoing philosophical and scientific debate, extending at least back to Descartes and the Mohists. There are many schools of thought in neuroscience and cognitive science which come to very different conclusions as to how, indeed, even if humans employ mental imagistic schema to think through problems, and if so, how much so. What is certain, however, is that regardless of how fundamental models and schema, logical or informal, heuristic, may be to cognition, we do not have access to those models other than by the very indirect trace, such as language or an image we might make of them. In that we don't actually think the way we think that we think. The inability to represent schema as such makes our own faculties of abstraction about this abstractions inevitably incomplete. For AI, does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. For AI, we do not have access to in the composing way, we do not have access to our own schema, regardless of regardless of whether or not and how much we use them, and therefore we cannot possibly then transpose or teach those schema directly into machines that would then make sense of what they are doing in the ways that we would. And so the old-fashioned, what was called the top-down symbolic modeling of AI, never really got very far. Now, in the play of representation and counter-representation in deep learning systems and in human cognition, one slides around the other in interesting ways. And these are related problems of how to then also to represent AI and how representation may or may not work in AI, and how deep learning systems can be forensically re-represented back to humans. Again, these three processes which I've identified. And in this, there are perhaps also echoes of Szilárds' characterization of the manifest and latent image of thought, in this case, a kind of machinic thought, and also of the role of our intuitive sense of how we think, and how this is at odds, in fact, with the underlying reality of that thought. That is, the apparent failure, quote unquote, of good old-fashioned AI and symbolic logical models in general is at least partially due to the fact that the manifest images of our own behavior in our own worlds are inaccurate. We cannot teach those models of a process to a machine because our intuitive models of our own thinking and doing may be lovely, but wrong. Now, more recent AI research then, as said, is strongly influenced by these anti-representationalist programs within neuroscience that prioritize also, for example, machine intelligence, physical, sensory, or motor embodiment, and deprioritize the role of representation of a problem space. For example, and those of you who know this literature, the Rodney Brooks, 1991 essay, Intelligence Without Representation. Rodney is a roboticist at MIT, marked an important turning point in this work. Now, for some, the shift away from formal models to bottom-up interactions paralleled the phenomenological critique of Cartesian mental imagery, though also perhaps overemphasizing relations to objects through a notional being at hand and so forth. For others, this would draw from and toward an embodied, embedded cognition, for which thinking is shaped by an organism's sensory and nervous systems, its interactions with environments, including as well as the brain. So for these distributed cognition theories, thinking is also externalized into tools. And so for computer-human, computer-robotic, computer-AI interaction, an arrangement of functional artifactual surfaces allows, for better or worse, the employment of familiar heuristics and also the training of new ones. So more generally, our conceptual metaphors and schema may not always be essential to how we actually accomplish tasks, but they also still allow, still for the shuttling and mobility of metaphors and solutions between unlike domain and problems. If we solve something in one domain, we can abstract that solution from one domain and employ it to a completely unlike one because we have this capacity for a kind of abstraction of the space. However recursively, reflexively conscious we are of that abstraction, we're able to produce this and make this mobility. This is a sort of general, the sort of the capacity for a general intelligence that we're quite good at, and of which this capacity of abstraction, particularly aesthetic abstraction, is this essential capacity of and faculty of art, understood in this sort of evolutionary sense. So for us, the capacity to know when to apply an abstraction, learn from one experiential context to a different context, and to consider and simulate even possible paths is a neat talent. And one relying largely on our big prefrontal cortex. Now, considered as a benchmark for a general artificial intelligence that not bound to a specific application like finding dogs, its own synthetic prospection would make use of very different kind of material assemblages based on interactions with sensory environments that are rather alien to us, even if we are also present within them. Now, in terms of this kind of functional abstraction, then, consider the interplay of contemporary AI and robotic design problems. One way to teach a driverless car, for example, how to drive, is to teach it the rules of the road and then outfit it with a sensory apparatus that's needed to gather inputs that it can match against those rules. But another way to teach it to drive is to have it literally watch humans drive and then make contextual decisions as we go. And this is how we train neural network, the deep learning system to do this. The AI then is, in this case, inclusive of this complex sensory apparatus and may see the world with infrared light, may use LiDAR, scan at 360 degrees. And unlike a human driver, the ultimate outcome is an AI that is capable of navigating its own perceptual little world of the street in ways that appear to be functionally equivalent to human navigation and may even in some ways surpass it. However, having learned this, it is responding to inputs and structuring responses in ways that may be incompletely decipherable to its programmers at best. They can train it, but they do not always have a direct model of what is going on in the black box. And as said, this is partially due to the lack of certainty as to what kind of model or non-model may be appropriate to re-represent its functions back to us. The deep learning solution, as described then, does not rely on a recursion of human conceptual models of human conceptual models, but trains artificial neural networks by feeding them input information that biases the formation of patterned connections between artificial neurons such that this network's outputs are become responsible and appropriate to its technological function. It can drive. Now, while a network learns to pilot an autonomous vehicle by watching humans navigate normal and abnormal road conditions and learn to perform, quote, driving, it's not learning a human model of driving. Even though it watches human drivers under observation, the AI it produces its own functional response to the problem space of driving. As encephalization evolved as an emergent feedback for us, an emergent feedback mechanism to serve the needs of the body that hosts the brain, for the AI driver, thinking is an intensification of a particular pattern in the network layers. It does not, once more, require a formal logical representation of its own processes in order to do so. The network expresses intelligent outcomes, but of what sort? Is training the AI driver akin to training a dog to understand commands about its world, or more like training a rock with cuts to be sharp enough to have arrowhead functionality? It's in fact more the latter. And so, qua Stiegler, if the acquisition and manipulation of technologies led to the evolution of our own higher brain functions, at what point does AI as tool and AI as user acquire the same capacities? Is it on a similar or disparate path? The answers, of course, are philosophically and politically complex. Should the AI driver decide to one fine day to just stop or do something even more weird? It may do so for reasons that are unknown and perhaps unknowable. Artificial neural networks may, in their way, form something like models of their behavior, but even if that doesn't necessarily mean that they are, in fact, representable. We may ask them to re-represent their thinking back to us. This is a reasonable request, but it may, in fact, be impossible. To summarize, then, we have multiple models of representation and the absence of representation in play. There is a model of how the human thinks that a human drives a car, the manifest image of its behavior. There is a model of how a human models this model to teach an AI to drive a car. There is a, quote, model of how a deep learning system is trained to drive a car, which may be inscrutable. There is a model of how that deep learning system then must be represented back to the human so that they know what's going on and to decide on the legality, propriety, or viability. Optimistically, these may in some way form potentially some kind of synoptic image in which our own manifest model is trained even, is changed by how we see how this other system managed to solve the problem space, and by the representation of that deep learning model, and whereby we learn from the AI by seeing our own model from an outside perspective that it provides. For the societal comprehension and absorption of AI, we may allow for the potential political implications of translation, or more precisely of abstraction. So finally then, machine vision is not just a new way of making images. It is a way to visualize and conceive matter's own provisional abstractions. Weaving between hidden layers, moving further and closer away from the pictorial, we find genuine abstract machines. In response, art tries to articulate a vocabulary of what it is, what it is not at work, how it is apart and apart from us. Moving with, about, and among machine vision, then we point to various moments of leverage that delve directly into the ontogenesis of raw physical sensation, folded into material intelligence. It measures the shadows as they are burned. More polemically, an active engagement on the definition and expression of what will be normative AI by positive projection as well as by counter-normative negation is required, and is one way to mobilize our own nuanced techniques further towards numinous self-disenchantment, a setting loose of abstraction as a physical and political process, not a preservation of its traditional authority as a metaphysics of ceremony. Distinctions are necessary between matter that actually thinks and can work back on the world accordingly, and matter that merely occupies a common plane on within a proposed narrative of interaction. The latter tends to conflate AI with panpsychic idealism, but the former is no more animistic than marveling at a locomotive. Art's articulation of ways of knowing through the abstraction of machinic processes far precedes deep learning technologies. And its own glossary of sensitive neologisms index in advance what machine vision is doing, and so may provide ways into, not out of, the problems of AI and representation. Boris Groys's discussion of the infernal cybernetics and minimalism's mimesis of thinking is relevant. There's another discussion in the longer text from this. With machine vision, both as point of contact between AI and its worlds, and a trace reserve for us to imagine and even represent AI, is, we will discover, the most realistic depiction may be bracingly abstract. The most realistic depiction may be bracingly abstract. And what is depicted is itself a process of abstraction. Abstraction as realism. Abstraction in this sense is a reduction of a condition to a form, through which one may represent conditions other than that from which the figure is drawn. What we would describe would place certain kinds of machine vision and AI processes and their effects into interpretive categories. And this is not only a set theory, it's a kind of functional dimensional reduction. As for all reductions, from data compression to abstract expressionism, raw information may be lost, but interpretive clarity and pattern is gained. This is necessary to make sense of sentient matter that we release out into the world. And so art and design have an essential and privileged seat at the big backpropagation table, where we try to train AI and are in turn counter-trained by it in evolutionary symbiosis. In order to make good on this, quitting certain precious demands regarding the realism of anthropological self-representation is likely the table stakes. That said, it's not as if Google's own algorithms are not themselves paranoid. After all, they see psychedelic dog faces in everything. The reason that Deep Dream hallucinates dogs is itself not spooky. Its object recognition faculties were trained using the ImageNet dataset, which is based on various breeds of dogs. It will therefore hallucinate dogs, where there are none, and identify people as dogs, if it is told to look at them hard enough. The latter may seem insulting, but it shouldn't. Diogenes' proto-cosmopolitanism was, after all, based on the glorious dog-like community of us all. Thank you.
And thank you, Ben. That's extraordinary, wide-ranging. I'm sure there's a heap of questions. I'm going to ask one just to kind of introduce the whole thing, and it's more an overview. Rehearse some of the issues again. Just and also a reminder that if you want to buy the stack and the book from Eflux, they're available over here at discount.
This material is not in that book.
No.
Just that, you know.
So if you want to understand what happened tonight, you need to read the big book over there. And David is here, sitting over there if you want to get a copy of it. So I want to sort of track backwards through the talk. And it seemed to me that at the end, what you were suggesting was almost that insofar as the AI need not self-represent, or need not sort of declare itself in ways that, as humans, we would expect a symbolic presentation of its processes and its consequences and its own functionality. It's almost as though the test of a true AI would be something like artificial unconscious. Right? So there's a process that takes place, it produces effects, it can't be articulated to the system itself or to an external observer, and it just stays unconscious. At some point it may go through some psychoanalytic process or sort of machining process. But
AI psychoanalysis, right?
AI
Big growth field, I think.
Start training now.
Exactly, yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you around that, I mean, the unconscious thing is a bit of a kind of theoretical throwaway. It seems like the main point around that was that a caution that we have to be careful to not over-identify what AI is doing in terms that we might expect intelligence to look like. And that includes partly a kind of a sense of discursive intelligence. So yesterday,
possibly,
yesterday was an issue about semantics against signaling, for example.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to track that in relationship to a point sort of halfway through the talk where you made a claim that what's happening with AI is a manifestation of a more ubiquitous computing that's always happening in matter itself.
Or can. Or can. It has happened many. I mean, there's a ways in which. So let me. Do you want to? No. You want to continue? The claim is that there are many different ways in that intelligence we need to understand as a particular kind of emergent property of matter. It's not always happening everywhere. It's not a kind of pan-psychic kind of thing. But it can happen in lots of different places, and has and is already happening in lots of different places, but not everywhere.
Right.
It's actually a very specific kind of effect and a specific kind of process. There's certain ways in which we might imagine that there's kinds of generalized forms of abstraction and intelligence. You have things that are quite geometrically in common with one another, and things that are quite different with one another. And they might have different capacities and densities of neural capacity, way to do. And so there may be some correspondences and some forms of difference between the two. Like, what I'm saying is that if we allow for understanding AI to be something that also exists along the spectrum in some way, that understanding and certain sort of attempts by understanding it in its own terms that will fail. We will never really have this sort of clarity for it as well. Will have the effect of having us understand a little bit more where we sit on this spectrum as well. And so it'll teach us this process as well. And I was also saying that vision itself, as well is also this kind of process by which chemoreceptor cells become photoreceptor cells.
Right.
And so we can see machine vision as it exists in sort of evolutionary terms as being this sort of point of convergence between this much, much longer arc by which matter becomes photoreceptive in systematic ways, and matter becomes capable of abstraction in systematic ways. And now we have a version of this by which these converge with a mineral substrate rather than a carbon-based substrate.
Okay.
So this is it, hope that was clear.
Yeah, enough. But I think what I want to ask about is in terms of the general history of computation.
Oh, but on the representation thing, I'm sorry. Did you want? Was it the? Yes. It's thought that many cases these systems work in ways that sometimes they work in ways in which there may not be a recursive representation happening, and sometimes they work in ways in which even if there is a recursive representation happening within the system, by which it's capable of making abstractions about its own processes that it could apply to a different problem space. We do not necessarily have access to those representations, or if we force access to the representations, those representations may not be communicable to us in significant kinds of ways. And so this was this distinction to make. So I wanted to answer that point. Sorry.
I'm going to ask it very quickly because I guess there's a bunch of questions that people want to ask. Essentially, the question is around the generality of computing that's happening within matter anyway, which your claim is AI would now let us realize as a form of intelligence against the specificity of computation as we understand it through technical development of the 20th century. It seems to me that the argument depends upon a generalization of computing in matter, but no. Okay.
I think there's two different ways in which you could do it. I think there is an interesting discussion to be made about the computational processes, the computational substrate within matter itself, and the ways in which computation can operate through many different kinds of material substrates. And there's another discussion about whether matter is ultimately, whether the universe is discrete and whether it's all a big computer, and that's not what I'm talking about. It's a different discussion. I think there's ways in which intelligence can emerge from matter that are non-computational. In fact, I think most of the ways in which intelligence emerges within matter is probably non-computational. Many ways it's computational at certain scales and non-computational at others, and then computational again at other kinds of scales. So I think the idea that there is is working the way, I don't think you need to argue for the computational process, though in many ways, in fact, it may prove to be an effect of natural computation. How it is that ants decide whether or not they're going to make a bridge or not make a bridge as they go around something of this as well. There's a kind of computational process, or at least a kind of decision tree at work in a kind of algorithmic reasoners work as well, but it's also based on, at one level, but it's really based on this sort of chemical sensing or biosensing at another. And so I don't think you need to make this sort of digital physics pan-computationalist argument to identify matter as a potentially a general property of things, nor do you need to say this, make this sort of panpsychic move to say everything is already intelligent. It's not.
Okay, all right. Can I see who has questions? There's one here, Annie, there's one over there. All right, we'll take those two. If there are more questions coming up, I'll take them. There's one there.
Thank you for the talk. In the history of philosophy, cognition, knowledge and thinking are not identical. They might be quite different ontologically and epistemologically. Does machine make this differentiation between thinking, cognition and knowledge?
I'm certain that it does. I think part of the question. I think how so is an open question, and I think it really depends on the kind of machines that we're talking about. I think you could make machines by which the relationship between what we might call thinking and what we might call cognition would have a kind of would work quite differently than they would within a different kind of machine. I mean, these are words, they're terms, right? And that their correspondence to the underlying reality that they describe may be quite different with the kinds of mechanisms that we're looking at. But I think what we certainly allow for is that the models that we have of our own thought and the models by which philosophy and neuroscience try to model these questions of thought, that they presume that there would be a kind of isomorphic projection onto the ways in which AI would work is extremely unlikely. Yeah.
It's you.
Critical mind.
It's me. It's me.
You're the feedback mechanism.
I don't know, or it just doesn't want me to say.
Small extension of
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah.
You said a very
And I mean,
interesting.
I just say, thinking and cognition and knowledge are words that we use to think about our thinking and cognition and knowledge. And we separate these phenomena, these experience of these phenomena with these terms, to the extent to which they correspond to actual things going on inside the pink goop that we secreted from the top of our spinal column that we keep in the skull box, is a whole different question around this sort of as well. Now, to the extent to which a machine that is a machine that is doing something that appears to us to have kind of intelligent properties, again, to the extent to which that those models would extend onto it, I think we should be open to the idea that, in fact, what we would discover in really beginning to understand or attempting to understand what's going on in there would generate terms and concepts that may reveal that terms like thinking and cognition are in fact a kind of folk language that is much more provincial and parochial than we anticipated.
Oh, that's great. But
Yeah.
extension of my question, you said a wonderful phrase. We do not think the way we think that we think, something like that.
Yes.
Then what is the subjectivity that can grasp the way we think? Is there any authenticity of the way we think? And was the history of thought interested in this authenticity ever? Maybe the fiction of thought is not a big problem. Maybe the fiction of thought was inscribed in the history of thought.
I think the fiction of thought was inscribed in the history of thought is probably certain. Yes.
All right.
This is the, yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to build slightly on Suhail's question actually yesterday, and it's taken two of your presentations, and I'll just sort of shoot through and come to the question, which is to do with being caught somehow between, on the one hand, genuinely encountering the unthinkable, and on the other hand, not being able to escape the sort of normative regime of the symbolic order that we exist in, and constantly reinscribing that desire for the unthinkable onto something, but it constantly sort of recedes as we approach it. I was thinking about I'm thinking about label farms, image data sets being labeled by big groups of people in dark rooms, churning through billions of images.
That's not how it works. But okay. Yeah.
There's data sets that, in a sense, need their sort of ground truths set by labeling farms that categorize the initial training data, in a sense, and all subsequent training.
There's lots of ways in which that labeling works. But the function of those labels and the ways in which those labels then become self-reinforcing mechanisms, if that's where you're going, this is certainly the situation. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. Go ahead.
No, but maybe that's a very naive way of putting it back into the sort of construction of visibility and that neural network imagery, in a sense, gets constantly folded back into that. I'm just wondering whether what we're looking at is not deep learning generating genuinely unthinkable visibility or a kind of visibility that hasn't existed before, but rather that we're looking at the output of research in AI. It's not the output of AI, it's the output of research in AI.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at the whole, that which frames that research, which itself is not outside of what constructs our sort of.
It is and it isn't, and this is part of the. There's a paradoxical and overlapping quality of this as well. That is what you've hit on. What you've hit on is not a vague description of a precise condition, but a precise description of a vague condition. And that is that on the one hand, first of all, I should say that what we call AI, and even what we call machine learning, represent a diverse range of very different kinds of techniques and technologies, and the ways in which certain the strengths and weaknesses and procedures of one don't necessarily correspond to a lot of the other, and so things that things that we may say about one don't necessarily hold for the other. And I as I said last night, I think in not too many years we just won't use the term AI at all anymore because it's just too vague. It just describes too many different kinds of things. However, I think what you're saying in many cases for, particularly for trained learning systems, where data sets are labeled in a particular kind of way, and they're structured in a particular sort of way, and they're corrected around which those labeled kinds of ways, the patterns that a system would see, if what we're talking about is a pattern finding algorithms, right? I mean, there's other kinds of things that have very different kinds of functions, but in that case, yes, what you tend to see are ways in which categorical systems, they see what they're told to see, and they'll find dog faces and things if that's what they're told to find. And if we're using the system to find whatever it is they're sort of finding, these will become these recursive kinds of processes. But there's also any number of ways in which, again, the old axiom that these technologies produce these sort of different kinds of accidents, that there's ways in which the research will be trying to solve a particular kind of problem or try to optimize a certain kind of thing, and something completely unexpected and strange and seemingly noisy, catastrophic, ends up getting sort of spit out the side. Right? General adversarial networks, for example, which is kind of a really interesting area by which this sort of work was in largely respects not a deliberate research project. It was a kind of what happens if you put this beaker and that beaker, and what will bubble up around this sort of as well. And so it's both of these at the same time. There's ways, and again, this question is, but the question that makes it even harder is, how do we know exactly which is sort of which, right? If we're using these systems in such a way that the purpose of them is ways to help is a kind of epistemological extension technology that will allow us to differentiate correlation from causality in a particular way, and to sort of reduce the apophenia of our intuitive incapacity to deal with extremely really large complex systems, and ones that may develop over temporal scales that are too slow for us to understand or too fast for us to understand. It may come back to us with replies as to what those relationships are that seem to us to be completely insane. At what point do we then know that whether or not it's actually whether it itself is whether this is true or not, or whether this is in fact relation to that, without reintroducing the intuitive bias that in principle the system is put in place to rid us of one as well. And so this is exactly what I'm trying to lay out a bit with this talk, this question of the role of representation within the system, but the representation of representation within the system is in a way a kind of is a recursive problem without a simple solution. But I think it's in fact because of this abyssal process that I do think something more is happening here than just a replication of our own sort of labeling theory.
Let me just while people are thinking, there's a question there. Let me just ask this one while the mic goes up to you. So there's two questions over there. So just to take up this last point, does the in a way the required recognition of our self-limitation of what AI opens up beyond us, as regards art, it seems to me there's a kind of meta-apophenia going on if we think of the image as the kind of the required interface for thinking about what happens with AI through the artwork. And also maybe there's a
well, machine vision in particular.
Machine vision.
Yeah, I mean specifically with machine vision of asking. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But just a bit further than that, maybe there's another kind of, because in a way that Feeney thing is a standard formatting thing that we introduce onto whatever we encounter. But maybe there's through the kind of received history file, the meta-apophenia might be the requirement that we experience or encounter something in front of us that we have to interpret, that we have to look in a certain way, because it seems that what AI might introduce that we need to understand and which art could intervene in is a kind of distributed form of presentation or distributed formatting that we would need to encounter in other ways than we're used to thinking about art.
That's exactly right. That's, yeah, I mean, the way this is, I think, I hope that I laid out something similar to that in the in the talk. So I think that was a good, I mean, I think I would agree with this. And I think this sort of question of understanding this kind of this a larger distribution of these of the sensing capacities, in ways where the sensing capacities actually are linked to different kinds of information processing capacities that are producing and sensing and making sense and differentiating and finding the true thing in the world in one way or another. How we see that, and how we ask that thing to make an image of how it sees, and how we see ourselves as it sees us, and we see ourselves as, I mean, all those kinds of recursions of this as well. It's not just we approach the image and have a necessarily apophenic relationship to this. There's a kind of several orders of meta recursion sort of at work there as well. So it's the seeing of the seeing and so forth. Yeah.
This question.
Thanks very much for the talk. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more, because in the UK and in the US, obviously, there's discussion about practices of thinking, practices of representation, of artistic architectural projects, and that you're involved in that clearly. But I'm interested in, for example, the way in which your work has this proximity to Haraway. So we have the dog companion species, which is the algorithmic found image. There's also, obviously, your points about the non-human, the concept of absolute alterity, which is now something which extends beyond just a sort of normative identity politics of the practitioner or of the thinking or of cultural formation and matter. But I suppose I'm just interested about the extent to which there is capacity for specificity or political practice within this without it becoming a conversation about Instagram quantification and the kind of proliferation of subject position, moment, temporality, or deep time. So really I'm just interested in the extent to which you do see capacity for political agendas. For example, I'm thinking the xenofeminist discussion, which is within this context of abstraction and of political difference that is not just going to go back into a tech Silicon Valley corporate structure. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of what tomorrow's talk is about, and Helen Hester will be the respondent for that as well, and so which I'm very sort of pleased with. I'll quickly then give a couple of responses to it. The quite appropriate question. One of the AI is also being posited at this moment as a kind of geopolitical gambit. We just came back with the group last week from Shenzhen in Hong Kong, where we met with Baidu and Tencent, and China has specifically indicated that they see their movement towards preeminence within a multipolar geopolitical order is one that's predicated upon their success within developing AI as a geopolitical strategy. Macron's white paper from a few weeks ago, Obama had a different one as well. It was that some of the people from AI Now had been involved in the drafting of as well. I was in Moscow when Putin met with the school children and said that whoever wins, whoever develops AI will rule the world, or something to this effect as well. I think one of the things that I'll also be dealing with, I'll also talk a little bit about in the talk tomorrow night, but also in the next book, is the shift towards what we call these multipolar hemispherical stacks. Instead of seeing this single planetary computational apparatus, there's the transnational state systems are producing and cohering and defending their own specific state apparatus at the kind of demarcated expense of the other. And the role of AI in the formation of these in the formations of these geopolitical structures, which are not just machines that states wield. The stacks themselves in a way become the governing apparatus over which the state has certain kinds of sovereignty. These apparatuses themselves, which are in essence sensing the world, whether it's our phone calls or our email or just everything and producing models of their polity and governing those polities through the models of those polities, is a form of recursive abstraction at a societal level, by which a society is, or at least a polity, is in principle capable of producing and simulating itself and governing itself through those simulations. I think that's extraordinarily interesting, but also it's potentially quite interesting, but also quite dangerous kind of development, but one that I think is something that we need to really we need to understand the capacities for this and to understand the forms by which, those certain forms of algorithmic governance may take shape. I'm on the advisory board of a group based in NYU called AI Now, that specifically is focusing on bias within AI systems and goes through these questions of labeling theory and the ways in which certain really shitty data that's improperly categorized produces and amplifies and exacerbates to horrific degrees all different kinds of forms of social violence that just become automated in these kinds of structures as well. And so on the one hand, I think there's this kind of really essential kind of plumbing work to make sure that the systems that we have are actually doing something remotely like what we believe and that they claim that they're doing. And on the other hand is being attentive to the ways in which we're not just talking about one system, but rather a system of systems that has aggregate effects at multiple layers, accidental megastructure of sorts, and to understand how it is that those systems themselves are, at least for us, not only capable of producing models of the world, but are in fact producing rather large scales, rather intricate models of the world, ecological systems, political systems, cultural systems, the interrelation between those different kinds of sort of structures and connotations. And as such, are not just something over which politics may have something to say. They're increasingly becoming the mechanism by which governance with a small g happens in the first place. And that's not necessarily bad. There's things that we can do with that. There's things, a way in which you can actually organize economies, organize value, organize a distribution of resources in ways that are much more, that are in fact much more desirable, and that this becomes this kind of structure of a design problem. And so this is some of the stuff we'll be talking a little bit last night, and maybe it connects a little bit up with some of the discussions of the xenofeminist thing. Donna Haraway is a whole other kind of story, and which I think I've been admirer of her work for most of my adulthood, so appreciate the comparison for sure.
Okay, and do you have a dog? That's it.
I don't have a dog. I would like to have a dog. I have a cat. I have a cat.
Much better.
And the cat is named Computer.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the talkative talk and the visuals. So I just wanted to sort of make a really minor comment back to the image thing.
Thank you.
It strikes me that the image is extremely evocative, rich, and I'll stick to the us-them kind of distinction. So for us, the image is extraordinarily meaningful, very quickly and easily meaningful. But for them, it's a bit of a struggle.
Who's them?
Them, the computer, the machine.
Oh, okay.
The machine of power, whatever you say. But still, we're stuck, and we are very sort of stuck into the idea of getting them to organize images and to sort of get, it's just to squeeze knowledge and new stuff out of images. And I wonder if that's just why that is, since it's so difficult to, I mean, facial recognition is pretty tough in the wild. You have to, everything has to be so constrained for them. So are there other ways that we can get meaningful knowledge out of them without using the image? And why do you think it is that we use the image so much?
Actually, so I'll start with the last one. This is an interesting question. I think why are we interested in images?
Why are we interested in them being interested in images?
Aha. So I think the question of why we're interested in images. I think there's probably an evolutionary. It's figuration and an externalization is something that our capacities for abstraction evolved with. That we learned how to think abstractly through the process of abstract inscription. I think this is part of the fundamental talent of aesthetic abstraction. It's something that we sort of worked with in this as well. And so, the basic answer to the question is we're interested in images because images are thoughts. Images are models, they're constructions. Like why we're interested in their interest in the image. I think because, I think this is a much longer sort of question for this as well, because I think we're interested in how it is that how we are represented by them. I think that this question of what I call the sort of inverse uncanny valley, but this alienation of our own the sort of appearance of ourselves to ourselves through this moment of a kind of distantiated counter recognition of ourselves as something to be seen in this way is something that is, I think, is tremendously sort of interesting. I'm not sure I quite got the vector of your question, but I hope that my answer was still useful. Okay.
All right, so while the mic's moving, there's a question over here, another one over there. Maybe we could take them together and you could
whatever
answer.
whatever I can go.
Whatever I can't because I'm going to finish quite soon. Okay, Bridget, go ahead. I was going to ask one, but you have the mic, so please go ahead.
In many ways, I think my question might relate to the previous question, and it was just I wanted to ask. Thinking back, it really struck me, or stuck in my mind, that you said at the beginning of the talk, you said hooray for the effable, and you talked about...
which is the inverse of the ineffable.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I think you said hooray for the...
right, I just wanted to make sure that that context was clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because you were also talking about your quiz notion, or the notion of the technical irreducible in his use of and I just wanted to ask how we can loop back to those terms, or how what is there a kind of an estrangement or a kind of alienation of the technical irreducible, or in where we end up here at the end of your talk?
An estrangement of the irreducible,
Well, I'm thinking about in terms of this question of sort of human interpretation and how we see ourselves seeing, or how we see the machine, or how we see the machine seeing ourselves seeing, and also thinking about and kind of distributed kind of cognition.
Right.
How then, what form then might human interpretation kind of take, or what might be effable, if you like, in your array?
I think it's an interesting question. I think what I'm trying to sort of hope to have set up with the talk is, I think, is really in many ways precisely this line of question. To the extent to which it's perhaps part of that alienation, or part of that demystification or disenchantment in that oscillation between the ineffable and ineffable. The oscillation may appear to be a kind of irresolvability. One of the dynamics of this disenchantment that we're talking about are working, at least, as I said, at least in a couple directions. On the one hand, that there's things that we we might understand in a sort of intuitive model of how the world works, that we in fact demystify through a certain kind of process, and usually involving kind of getting out of our own thinking. Some of the most fundamental ones we might really shift our sense of the centrality of our perspective from the cosmotechnics, what we might call Copernican traumas, where we imagine ourselves to be sort of at the center of a story, and whether that's through heliocentrism or Darwinian biology or neuroscience or biotech or increasingly AI, we get shifted off-center in a particular way. And in doing so, or microbes or astronomy, this is what usually these are technologically mediated kinds of things as well, and to me they are priceless accomplishments. Part of the potential Copernican trauma of AI is ways in which we can produce provisional models of thinking intelligence and so forth that are unexpected and unlike ones that we would have anticipated, that we would have modeled for ourselves, and so that the models that we have of our own thinking and thoughts and ways would, in fact, may become available to us, may be disclosed. They always were there, but they may in fact be disclosed by this outsideness and this alienation from this as well. That would be ineffable, I suppose. We have to find a better word for this, because without the context, people would think we're talking about something else, and it wouldn't make any sense. But yeah.
Do you want to follow up?
Is that? Did I answer your question?
Sort of, but I won't follow up just because.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
It's my second talk, and I'll be tomorrow as well.
Oh yeah.
Could you put the mic near?
Yeah, I'd like to frame, or as a starting point, I'd like to view things like from a post-human, post-anthropocentric, post-world. So I'm interested in the attractor on the other side, who's communicating to us. I mean, where's the arrow of time in terms of innovation, and where are we getting these ideas from, and why are we going towards, what does technology want?
Monolith.
The monolith?
Yeah, it sounds like the monolith from 2001. It's just like,
Yeah. I don't think it's coming from us. I don't think we're running this project. I don't think we're driving this train.
Right. Yeah. Without wanting to get into any conspiracy theory of ideas of the singularity, there is something that's attractive.
I do think the singularity is a conspiracy theory. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm sorry. You wanted to say? Yeah.
Sorry?
I don't know that it wants anything. Yeah.
Well, because at the moment we seem to be animals tinkering with gadgets, but
Yes.
there is a certain complexity that's already present in the universe, and
Yeah.
we're trying to discover and describe it and build artifacts. But I'm interested in the other side. How would we know? Would there be a discontinuity at some moment we don't know? We wouldn't be in the post-human. We wouldn't know anymore that we have become post-human. Would you?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we probably have to unpack your questions. I'll just say sort of quickly, I'm actually not so, the term post-human is something I have some trouble with this way. I think the diagram of the human is something that's constantly in transformation and constantly in flux, and I think the constitution and the composability of what the species is, or even the model of this, or what sort of the human with, is something that's constantly in transformation. I don't think of the human as a static thing that somehow will have an ending, and that something will happen after this as well. I think its own dynamism is quite the point. Yeah, this is also we are in effect, we're the residue.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you something. You began with
sort of invoking Juk's work, and I know Juk from when we were both PhD students here at Goldsmiths at the Center for Cultural Studies, and his work on the question of technology in China, and I guess his strong allegiance to Heidegger in that sense, and so yet your presentation and your research is much more suggestive to me of, just as a matter of course, I was rereading Guattari's Machinic Heterogenesis the other day, trying to, looking for certain kinds of ways of sort of conceptualizing a problem I was encountering in my own kind of work, and it strikes me that your work seems to be much closer to his argument, where technology is a subset of the machine, and we could argue, in this case we could argue that intelligence might well be conceptualized as a subset of the machine, rather than intelligence is that which engenders the kind of machine, which would be human intelligence is the agent that produces the machine. That would be a very conventional understanding of the machine, but yours anyway, simply kind of
no, I agree. So you
the ways in which Juk's work in his allegiance to Heidegger seems antithetical somewhat to what you've unpacked tonight.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I probably I don't recommend anyone really spending much time with Heidegger. Anymore. And Juk and I are good friends, but we disagree about most everything. And this is well, and this is I think part of the friendship that we have in this way as well. So it's not more of an invocation, but rather as a sort of it's just a way of sort of linking the question of what we're going to a different kind of reading of the provocation of what constitutes the cosmotechnical. I mean, the main sort of point in lots of ways is also Juk is not only Heideggerian, he's also quite a tradition, a kind of neo-traditionalist, where it's about this recuperation of these indigenous processes is the basis by which this forms of difference will emerge. And this is one. This also comes his fascination with Dugin and all the rest of this as well. I'm obviously it should be much more clear that the space of what would constitute or what would go into that space of a cosmotechnical diversification would be something to be invented and something to be composed and something that's highly unlikely to be found in the human anthropological record and just needing to be activated and rebrought to the fore. So in terms of the Guattari, probably I would need to reread this piece as well. I haven't read it in some time of this as well. I think that there's the way you remind me of it in terms of this hierarchy of subsumption of the technology within the machine and the intelligence in this as well. I think there's maybe ways in which we may want to identify reserve the term intelligence as something that can in fact operate at a number of different registers within this as well in quite different kinds of ways. I think there's ways. Certainly, it's not that there's an intelligence that comes bounding out of the Vitruvian man actor as he goes back upon the world with his wielding equipment and all of this kind of stuff, but rather as something that emerges in the interaction of these components and in these processes. And these components themselves evolve in a kind of techno-genetic way in relationship to the responses and the sort of in the interactions that they have that are themselves constitutive of the intelligence. So it's not so a bit like the intelligence of neurons is not in the neuron. It's in the interactions between them, and the intelligence between different kinds of sensing and processing little agents at landscape or urban scale is not just in the thing. It's in the interactions between the things, and in the interactions between the things, and in the constellation of them into different kinds of swarms or networks that have a very different kind of relationship other than the tetrahedral body plan or the canonical industrial machine. It's in those interrelations, in those networks, that intelligence emerges. The network is where the intelligence is. It's not just the thing the intelligence uses.
Yeah.
Is that
that's I think really well onto the way that Guattari is talking about. It would be the ways in which intelligence would be an emergent property of a set of machinic relationships, right? Exactly. So.
Yeah, it's an emergent property of the relationships rather than something that is bound by one of the things in the relationship itself, though in certain senses it may also be this too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. If you were at the Bartlett last night, you'll know that Ben can go on for incredible stamina for a very long time. Unfortunately, I have to finish.
Okay.
Because I have other commitments.
All right.
He's going to go to the pub with. He's going to go to the pub. I think the Rose. Yeah. Okay. Ben's going to go to the pub to the Rose, and I think you're welcome to come along and interrogate him further there.
Please, yes.
Just a reminder that the books are for sale, and finally, let's thank Ben.
Yeah, and we'll see you tomorrow night at the
And
ICA.
at the ICA tomorrow.